to warm up here. So you can just watch me staring off into the vagary. And Twitch still says offline, which is, oh, there we go. All right. Let's see what we're doing. Facade pattern. We'll go ahead and pop open our Storybox repository. Then head over to the wiki and our first semester. We are wrapping up the first semester with the facade pattern. And then I'll have 2 weeks off, and I'll get to go back through and fill out some of the resources I want to, trim some things up, maybe do some organization. I don't know. We'll see before we start the second semester. So let's make sure our solution is up, which it is. So last week, just as a small recap, we did the chain of responsibility pattern. And that allowed us to really trim up our main method. Before it was already done in code, things were kind of willy-nilly, but now we've got more of a flow going on. And so we accomplished that with these handlers, and we allowed our base handler to define what our game flow would be. And then we stuck all of that logic into our game context. And this is really important for our attempt at clean architecture. Because what we're saying is... Alright, hang on. Hold on. There's someone at the door. My puppy is going crazy. Alright, so crisis averted. Alright, so where are we? Alright, so our game context really allows us to keep everything in one neat place in terms of the game itself. So we come in, we hit process. We go to the game handler first, and we call its method to process, and we pass in our game context. And then it's going to go through our player load handler, our game selection handler, and then finally our command handler. So this is all just kind of recap from what we did last week. So nothing crazy. Let's close all but that. So we're in a good place. However, we're writing an application, and typically you'll have more than one context within the application scope. So you might have a membership context that handles logging in and the security around logging in. A lot of things that your game doesn't need to know about. So let's create an application context which is going to house our other contexts. And to do that, we're going to use the facade pattern. And this guy. So the definition of the facade pattern is to provide a unified interface to a set of interfaces in a subsystem. Facade defines a higher level interface that makes subsystems easier to use. This is a great place to talk about, just very quickly, the difference between an API, right, and well, really just a facade. So we can call our game context an API. It's not very user-friendly. It's designed for a very specific purpose. But when we get out to our calling layer, it leaves a lot to be desired. So when I hit process, I don't really know what's going to happen. I don't think it's really up to the game context to declare that to me, or to explain it to me. Probably something that's better left for your internal comments, your internal documentation. But I do want something that's really easy to use. I do want a facade that, while it does in some ways operate as an API, it's more like a user interface. So if I was to come to Google Maps, right? So this entirety that we're looking at is the facade, right? And then underneath of that is calling various APIs. I hope that makes sense. So you're going to see the same thing when we deal with pretty much any application. So let's go ahead and create a new, not there, I'm sorry. Do I want to make it in core, or do I want to make it in the actual command layer? I kick myself later. We'll do it here just for the sake of cleanliness. So typically, I would create a new item at the calling layer. I'm just going to call it app context. And it's here because I'm only defining this application, right? This presentation tier, this console project. So putting an app context here. If I decide that I want to have a facade at a higher level, it'll probably go in my core. And I said this last week, it's a pretty, I say simple, because it really just encapsulates a bunch of things and then wraps those calls in a way that's easier to use. So, one of my properties is going to be a public game context, get and set. So, as we're going through this, we're going to define a few things that separate this facade from kind of the API of our context. And in doing so, we hope to kind of also touch on the open-close principle. So the O in solid. All right. So all we really want to do here is we want to say that public void game start. And then inside of this, we want to call this process command. So let's go ahead and call this just start. Cool. All right. And so, first point, the reason why this looks redundant, but the reason why this is if we had a membership context that was also operating in here, and we wanted to, before every time the game started, we wanted to check that membership context to make sure that it was in a certain state. But the membership context might be specific to this application. So all of that code shouldn't live in the game context. It needs to live someplace else. And that's where our app context comes in. So this becomes this facade for what could be multiple different things. So right now we just have game start. So if I switch this around a bit, I'll give this a constructor. Public app context. And my constructor, I'm just going to new up a game context. There's a new game context. So now this is broken, and we want it to be. So if we do var context is equal to new app context. And note we don't have to change anything on the left-hand side of the assignment because we're using var. So it's implicitly deriving its type from the right-hand side of the assignment. And then when we're here, we're just going to say context dot game start. So we could definitely have a lot of things happening inside the app context. We could have it shift, right? We could have it go from, okay, use the login context or the membership context to have the user log in, because maybe one user has a one-to-many relationship with characters, so members can log in and they get to decide which character they want to load, or anything, right? So those things are separated. Or maybe they're logging in via Google or Facebook, which has its own mechanisms that we don't want to intertwine with our game context. So we're still saying game start. We could say something along the lines of login start or begin. Anything we want we have the full freedom here to name things we want and do what we want that makes the most sense for our calling layer without having to change code inside of our other contexts. Then another good example of the open-close responsibility pattern is that, the open-close principle, is that we want to make sure the game context can be extended and used and be very flexible, but we never want the code to change in response to the needs of the calling of the presentation tier. And so one good example of that is, let's say that I wanted to give the ability, because remember, I've got a game selection handler, a player load handler, and a command handler. Let's say that I wanted to give the calling layer, for whatever reason, the ability, public void, to set the game selection handler. Right? Because mine is talking to one database. It's going to be doing things in its own very opinionated way. But we want to say, hey, if you want to use all the same logic and the only thing you want to swap out is where the games come from and control that part of the flow, then I want to give you the ability to do that. So I can say, this will take in a game handler called handler. And then I want to say that my game selection handler is something different. So let's go ahead and pop these guys out into fields so we can get to them. Private game handler is equal to new player, player load handler is equal to new player load handler. Private game handler, game selection handler is equal to new game selection handler. Private game handler, game command handler is equal to new game command handler. All right, so nothing crazy there. Then up here, instead of newing up these things, I'm just going to say that the seeded value, the very first one I know is going to be the player load handler. So let's get rid of these guys. And then I'm going to set the successor. That's my private fields. Okay, so we bumped out those private fields to a place where we can actually set them as we like. So down here, I need to say that I'm changing out my game selection handler. So my game selection handler is now going to become the handler I get passed in. And then the onus is on me to make sure the rest of the handlers are still set properly. So set successor, game command handler, right? And I can use this internally. I can say set game selection handler. I could use it up here, and it would take care of the next two steps. We're not going to do that now. We're going to let the redundancy stay where it is, and we'll leave that for a code smell or a refactor for another time. But, so here's something that if I was on this side in the calling layer, and I said var g context is equal to new game context dot, well, I don't really care about the current command. I don't really care about the library item. I don't really care about any of these things. So it becomes a very poor way for the calling layer to interact with this this facade. What I would much rather do is say, okay, inside of my game context, you be responsible if you had some other handler that you wanted to use. You be responsible for setting it up in your constructor. So you get to decide through all these points of interaction, this programming interface with the game context, how you want these things to operate. That's your job. Your job in this facade is to map to the application programming interface, to the APIs, which in this case is your game object. I know it's like 3 terms, right? It's context, it's facade, and then there's API, right? So we have this facade, which could be anything. It could be a user interface. It could be something a RESTful interface. It could be anything. And then we need to have a way for it to kind of bridge and do the plumbing that speaks to maybe one of many different contexts, so that we get that nice, pretty context.GameStart. I'm just going to change this to app for the sake of ease of reading. So all I care is app.GameStart. That's all I care about. When I type app dot, that's all I see, right? And so in fact, let's go ahead and come back into this guy. And since there would never be a need to change from the outside, let's go ahead and make this guy private. Let's really close it down. We're just going to do our little naming conventions here. So now we don't even need this line. Again, very, very opinionated. We know exactly what we want to do, and we don't want any noise that doesn't belong. So now truly, when we come to app, and all we have to choose from is game start. That's all we can see. And this is what we want from our app context. When we're at this level, once we have a nice, pretty framework, we want to protect it from ourselves. All I can do is just do game start. Okay. But I've given, without having to go back in and change anything later on, based off of an evolving request or an evolving need, if I suddenly realize that, oh man, it'd be really nice to be able to change things around for, like, the phone, right, or a tablet, or just a mobile device in general, and I want to be able to change certain things about how the game loads, because when it's running on the server, or even on a desktop, it's much easier for me to get access to the files I need. But when I'm on a phone or a mobile device, those things are sandboxed in such a way that it really needs its own handler, right? It really needs something that's going to be able to deal with those specifics. But I don't have to come in here and write switch statements or pollute this game context with information about the running environment, right? Like, oh, if it's mobile, then load this context. Otherwise, load this context. I don't want any of that responsibility. All I want to be able to do is say, hey, let's defer that to the calling layer. You can swap this out to whatever you want. So, this is nice because as you're making an application, you can have this conversation with either yourself, hopefully you got that insight, members of the team or the business, and you can say, what extensibility do you envision? And this really comes back to the black art of writing applications, because the answer is going to be, oh, no, what we want today is what we're going to want for all time, which I promise you is never the case. So, inside of here, if you click on this link, pretty good write-up about this idea of like scope creep and feature creep and how it presents itself in the open and close principle, designing your application in such a way that you can kind of anticipate changes and deal with them gracefully. So some pretty easy examples to follow. I'd say easy, but pretty straightforward. Not a lot of moving parts. So pretty good. I like this guy. Probably send him a tweet. So, and this becomes critical when you are doing things like planning and doing requirements gathering and trying to predict hours and quote hours, because you're going to write tests around all these things. Something's going to give you a confidence. You're going to have a confidence model. You're going to say, I know this works because. So, once you know your game context works, it's better to not touch it again if you don't have to. Because as soon as you touch it, you have to introduce regression testing. Meaning that, okay, I touched this, and I have to be sure that nothing broke. And in order to make sure nothing broke, I've got to test every aspect of it again. And then milestone that change. And then push it back out into the wild. So, if you don't have to make changes to this context code, you're going to shave all future changes to the system by whatever that amount is. And we're constantly fighting in software development this adage that as a software project grows in time, it almost certainly grows in complexity. And as it grows in complexity, changes to the system become exponentially more expensive. And the way that we flatten those costs, which is the goal of any developer, is to keep those costs flat, is to introduce modularity and solid principles. This kind of ensures that architecture allows us to make changes to the system, to add complexity to the system, while really limiting the cost of those changes to something that's more fixed. So I know we're just talking about code and doing fun code things, but there really is the other side of development to be considered, which is, how do I ship good code? And how do I keep shipping good code? Because nobody gets to work in a vacuum. Alright, so now we've got a nice facade that all it's going to do is offer us the ability to be opinionated about what we want to expose and what our initial state's going to be. And as we grow, the only decisions we need to make about our subclasses or our subcontexts is whether or not they satisfy their core responsibilities and if they can be extended in the ways that are necessary. So we should stop thinking about, oh, does this game context do what the app context wants it to, right? We should only be concerned with, does the game context do what the game context is supposed to do? So, I think this all looks good. App start. Let us write a little more specific code in here into the app context. So I'm just going to do a new item just to show that part of the benefits of abstraction is being able to say that app state, that this tier, this presentation tier, can vary or grow independently from the core, the common, and the other tiers. I'm going to go public enum, app state. Ooh, hang on. And so I'm just going to call this app state running. Stop requested. We'll say stop. And we'll say, yeah. Okay. So we'll come back into our app context, and we'll give it another property. And we will make this one public. And then our constructor, when we're deciding how we want to bootstrap our app context, we'll say that the app state is equal to app state dot, we'll call it stopped instead. It's kind of an action word. Stop requested. Okay. So we've got an app state and an app context that, while they encapsulate other parts of our tier, they're able to be composed in ways that are unique to them and their needs. So then inside of here, so I'm saying app state stopped. So then instead of game start, I'm going to say that I want the app state is equal to app state running. And that is it. Okay. Cool. So I just hit start now, right? I'm going to say I got my app context. Does this even work? This little bit of code? Did I break something? This should all be fine, right? So just make sure. Cool. So if I go back to my program, nothing too crazy. This is me using the facade. Again, keeping it very simple because it is a very simple pattern that's supposed to offer just a cut the knot, right? So I forget the parable about Alexander cutting the knot, but it's instead of trying to keep solving complexity with complexity, we just take a step outside of it and we say, let's just make a facade. Let's do all of our plumbing and our wiring over here to make the rest of our implementation that much easier. Introduce, I'll say Gary, and then I pick my game, and it gets my little output, and I say command. I don't have anything with the command, that's next semester. But we're at least sure that we've got the beginnings of facade pattern. This is really going to come in handy next semester when we start adding complexity, right? We don't want to see any of that behind the scenes complexity past this wiring step. And probably going to be the ability to have commands flow through the app context and then get passed to the appropriate context. So you can imagine if I'm in a login state for the application, well then I want all commands to go to the membership context. And then when the application switches states, I want to then funnel all commands to the appropriate context. So this is really the role of our facade, is to kind of act as a router. And we'll look into the exact terminology we want to use, because I'm kind of antsy about just like creating names of patterns or applying like whatever name you use semantically as a pattern. But one of the sub-uses for our facade is definitely going to be the ability to route things as appropriate, so that inside of our program, all we really have to do is the bare minimum. So let's build on that. We've got our game start, public void. What if we just said app start? And then under app start, we wanted to do something. And even if all app start does is say game start, then we can see where we can start stacking our various things. I'm going to try to expand on this in a way that doesn't make it seem redundant. So every time we make one of these small changes, we then want to go back through and hide the things that the outside world doesn't need to see. Okay. So that looks good so far. Let's see where we're at. Again, and for all of this coding and playing, I didn't even look at this anymore, right? I'm pretty much done with this guy. So let's say we wanted to do a public void display game state. And then here we would do a console.writeLine game context dot game state. Oops. Game state type. And instead of our write line, we do have the ability to use a string format. So we'll say the current state of the game is. And again, very simple algorithm. Again, everything we write pretty much is an algorithm. We need to really identify that because it's important. And so, yeah, because talking ourselves out of the fact that something's an algorithm is how you get into trouble. You're like, oh, this isn't an algorithm. I can just start off with this very simple if case. And then suddenly, your if case turns into nested if statements. Nested if statements with switches. Then backing fields that only have a scope within your method that only apply to some deeply nested if statement. It's really the way things get out of hand. So it's a line in the sand that says if we go into this knowing that everything we write is an algorithm, then we can approach it with that same discipline of making sure that the single responsibility pattern, our principles are followed, that all of our code is sane and maintainable. Okay. So again, from my app state, from my calling layer, when I hit app, the discipline here is just constantly checking and making sure that what we see is all we want to see or should see. And so do I really need to see the app state? I want to see app start and maybe display game state as being two different things. But I don't know if I really care what app state is. Let's come back in and just remove our simple example. And let's do something a little more. We'll make this again, I'll make this private. Because again, I really don't think I care from the outside looking in what my app state is. But what if inside of this, I said public void app stop? Right? Let's just make it real simple by just saying start and stop. So it's possible that at this point, the only questions I really care to ask about my facade are, do you know how to start and stop yourself? I don't care if you're starting or stopping a membership provider and a game provider and a service layer. I don't care if you're logging out of things. I don't care if you're making sure that files have been successfully written to the file system. I don't care about any of that. All I care about is my ability to either call app start or stop. That's all I care about. Now, inside of my context, when I call stop, I can say if app state does not equal app state running console.writeLine cannot stop application. Or I'm sorry to say this. Application is not in a running state. So again, this is logic. So everything that I put here, any considerations that I make inside of my facade, as far as a front line accessing all of these other subsystems, really only pertains to this application domain, being the console application. So none of these things are questions that I would want to have to stuff into my game context or any other context. So again, this means unchanged. I can think about and I can discuss and I can argue with myself about what's the best way to approach these things, but I don't have to worry about changing any of my already written code, logic, or invalidating any of my tests. Okay, so we introduce a question about how does a game stop? How do we get that command to that context that says, hey, could you please wind yourself down? And so that actually leads into our next semester. We're going to talk about actually creating something that can be played, and looking at the remaining patterns that are required to really make that happen. And then hopefully when it's done, you can say, okay, I've got all the tools I need to really write a pretty sophisticated system, regardless of what it is, and not run into any of the bad programming habits that plague so many of us, right? So we've got an issue here where once the game starts, the game has complete control. And you'll probably see this sometimes if you've ever been inside a console application and it hangs and you've got no way to input commands, right? Whereas sometimes it goes through this facade, and so it receives the command and then it passes that command to the right context. So you've got a pre-interpretation of that command. You can say, hey, if this is a Control Z or if this is the letter X, don't pass it to this context that could be hung up or long running, right? All I want you to do is just kill everything in sequence. So that ability is gained to us by putting this facade up front. We can write our own interpreter, a very lightweight interpreter that only lives in the command project, that says, hey, I'm going to interpret before passing off to another context. And through that interpretation, I'll decide whether or not I stop everything, sending stop requests or handling that process, or if I go ahead and just delegate to wherever it needs to go. So again, making sure all of this, still works. Look at that. The monitor went off. Fuzz. App start. Cool. Everything still works as it's supposed to. So, hopefully, that sets the stage for next semester. So, I got about 5 more minutes. I'm just going to poke around and maybe rant once more. But I wanted to end the semester on a pretty straightforward pattern, because I think that once you get through the wiki and all these things, all these words and terms and then resources, your brain's probably full. But I gotta spell check this guy for sure. Is that even how you spell opinionated? So, but under the musings for the Facade pattern, you can say we started to create something fairly opinionated. I think this has a very special and well-meaning definition in the software world. Ideally, it means that you give up some creative freedom in exchange for built-in functionality, solid architecture, and some level of abstraction from low-level programming. .NET, IE, WCF, MVC, Web API, MEF, etc. They all give you this kind of buy-in, right? This very opinionated framework, and you don't have to think about too much of how that's implemented, near the metal. And so if you're just starting off and you're just getting started with programming and you're just learning design patterns, definitely want to give you Rails, right? Little training wheels that I still use to this day. When I approach a problem, I make sure in a very basic way, is it architected properly? Have I put things where it needs to go? Before I've done anything with the business logic, which we haven't done anything here, I just have a very simple scaffolding that allows me to look at it and say, okay, I've got a command project, I've got a common project, I've got a core project, I have a data project. Are all these things, are they sane? Because if they aren't sane this early, right, when we've done nothing, essentially, we're going to have problems. And it's also good to point out that even doing basic scaffolding generates quite a bit of code. Okay, so app context. Anything else we want to do here? No, we can do it in 3 minutes. And again, we've got game start here, and we've got start because starting the application doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to start the game right away. Starting the application might mean that we go through sort of authentication first. And then once you pass authentication, then we go ahead and start the game. Which means that we have all the freedom and maybe even the necessity to architect our command line application in a very similar way to our core game logic, in the sense that we want to be able to control how it flows from the login state to the game state to, I don't know, maybe the exit state. Alright, does all this look good? I think it does. I don't think this read key is necessary. Let's make sure that we don't do anything unnecessary. And so you've been watching for the last 6 weeks. Yeah, you'll definitely notice, and we'll just show this little, I can do this. Commands, they die because we have nothing to interpret commands yet inside of the actual game itself. We also don't have anything to really load a game. We only know what a game looks like. So we've got a really rock and roll next semester coming up. But this works, and if you've been following us all the way from week 1, then you can remember how this used to be, I don't know, 70 lines of code, something like that, and it was all text everywhere. It didn't seem to make any sense, but you should be able to logically go, okay, so it starts, and it goes to game start, and I'll just do this for the sake of demonstration, just right there, and then it goes to the game context start, okay, and this goes to game handler process, interesting, and then inside of the process, I can now say, okay, once we hit this, this is the flow of the application, or the flow of the game, through this context. So we keep chaining all these words together, which is a lot of fun, but I think it also demonstrates, if we come back over here, and we start talking about process flow diagrams and business flow diagrams, if you can get here and you can simply say those words together, then you're one step closer to being able to create a very relevant and very clear business process diagram. And so I'm partial to, let's see if I find a good example. I like swim lanes. Whoa. The internet is a broken thing. So I'm a big fan of swim lanes. I'm a big fan of being able to say, okay, in very simple words, is this big enough? I hope you can see that. Being able to describe your application at a high level. So if anybody comes along and says, hey, what does your module do? You're in charge of writing the game context, right, as a module. How do you plan on architecting that? What does it do? You should be able to draw this on a piece of paper very quickly, because all you're doing is saying, okay, well, my game context, my module, is going to take in the request, it's going to load the current state, it's going to display the prompt, it's going to take in user input, it's going to interpret that input, it's going to display the response, and it's going to unload the state, and it's going to move through until it goes back to the user for some further direction. And that makes sense. And it's much easier for you and everybody else to come from this, right? To come from this guy to this, where they can go one-to-one. Okay, it goes from load state, and maybe it does one or two things, and it comes down, Okay, and then it displays the prompt, and then it does the user input. And this all makes a lot of sense. And if you ever do like a code review or code critique, it's also very helpful. All right, so in a very undramatic, right, anticlimactic way, we're wrapping up this semester, and I hope this simple facade pattern is giving your brain a break, maybe to the point of putting you to sleep. But you should have seen how it's laying the framework for us to be able to, even with simply not writing a lot of code, we were still able to structure a facade that allows us to grow into our next semester of the application. So, and also a pretty good point, even by trying to keep things very, very simple, we still managed to write, 30 lines of code that does stuff. So imagine if we weren't trying to be simple, more straightforward. Okay, so I'm going to put this out there and call it a night. Anybody who wants to check this out and hopefully catch up on things we've done before, and drop me a line of any kind of comments or feedback, I look forward to it. Okay. And then I'll be off for 2 weeks, and I'll see you cats, hopefully with a very well organized and very exciting second semester, where we'll actually build out the namesake, the story box. We'll actually be able to load up a game and play it. It'll be a very simple game, I assure you, but it's going to introduce, and this plan might change, but it's hopefully going to introduce the command pattern. Again, we need some way to pass commands from our application context or facade to various other contexts and have them be interpreted. And then we need a strategy pattern, flyweight adapter. Some of this might change a little bit, but definitely commands in there and definitely strategy. All right, so that's it. I'll let the Twitch catch up for a second, and then I will bid you all adieu. Oh wow, I did not realize how dark it is in here. You can not even see me, that's incredible. Huh. Alright, so maybe on the list for next semester is definitely some better lighting. Alright, well thanks for dealing with what I'm now seeing as a very dark screen. And I'll see you guys in 2 weeks.